Welcome, welcome, welcome. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate you all spending your time with me tonight. My name is Brooke Higgins. I'm the founder and lead instructor of CROSSWALK Test Prep and Tutoring. Let's get some logistical stuff out of the way. If there are any volume issues, you can't hear me. If there's any glitches, shoot me a chat. If you can, feel free to use that chat function. I will be going through these slides here. After our presentation, I will upload this video onto my YouTube channel so that you can access it there. And for those that registered, I will send out links to these slides so that you have access to the slides as well. There are some links in the slides that obviously through Zoom you won't be able to get to, but maybe I'll pop them into the chat if I'm able to multitask while this is going on. Otherwise, it will be available. I will send out an email to all participants who do have access to the slides. Tonight, we are talking about basically what the testing landscape is now in college admissions. I think there's a lot of information and maybe some misinformation out there. I think there's a lot of confusion. We'll get into kind of a little bit of the history of that. Not that that's super important, but it gives you some context of kind of where we've come from and where we are now. But most importantly, I think we're going to think about your students. I think most folks on the call are parents. I do see some student names that I recognize, but we're going to be thinking through the lens of the student and what their process would look like. And if you are a student, what you need to know. If you're a parent, how you can support that student. So I'll go through these slides again. And indeed, as I mentioned, we are recording. So this will be available for anyone that is missing the program here. A little bit of background, if you'll allow me. CROSSWALK is now in business for, this is crazy to say, in business now for 20 years. We will officially have our 20th anniversary 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks from now. Not that you care, but I started this business while I was in business school here locally at what is now known as the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. Back then it was the Monterey Institute of International Studies. And I started with a market research class while I was getting my MBA. And I thought to myself, wow, maybe there's a need in the area for a tutoring business. And sure enough, there was. I started by doing some Spanish tutoring and tailored or kind of dovetailed into some test prep, which I had already done prior to starting this business. And here we are, 20 years later, this business still exists. Most of the folks on our call know me from the Stevenson School. I am a Spanish teacher at the Stevenson School. I've been at Stevenson now for, this is my 13th year. I think I have to go back and, yeah, 13th year. I am the department chair for world languages. I'm also head water polo coach for our boys program. But all before that, I was an entrepreneur and in business school, started this business again, and just really saw that there's a need for families, for students in the area to navigate testing. What I do work on with my students is have them understand my standardized test journey. It didn't start well. And I think that's important for students to hear. It didn't start well, but it ended really well. And a lot of that is kind of what I go through and what we'll go through tonight. So you kind of hear that. I did start by teaching the GMAT. My first client, I was living in Santiago de Chile in the late 90s, and I had a student I was teaching English to, and he said, hey, can you help me with the GMAT? The student wanted to go to business school in the United States, and he wanted help with the GMAT. And at that point, I was like, I don't know much about these tests, but he's like, you're a native speaker, you're from the US, help me out, I'll pay you. And of course, when he said, I'll pay you, I'm like, all right, let's figure this out. So we grabbed a Kaplan guide and we got to it. And I haven't looked back since. I've literally been doing test prep since the late 90s. So that's a little bit about me. This isn't about me at all. This is about where you are and what information is important to you, especially as we think about what this test optional means. And I'll get into that. So again, if you have questions, hit me up via chat. Otherwise, we'll just kind of go through this. Here's the questions I'm going to go through. These are the questions that I get. If I were to prepare a kind of a frequently asked questions, this is what I get from many families. What's the role of the SAT and ACT in college admissions? Years and years ago, it was much more important. Nowadays, and this is what we're going to get into, it can be important, but it's not as important as it used to be. Our second question that we'll get into is, what does test optional mean? I think there's some, like I said, some misinformation around that, and I will give you what I think is the generally recommended advice. And again, those of you that are at the Stevenson School, this is also echoed by our college. Important to know, and I didn't mention this in the outset, an additional role that I have at Stevenson is a college counselor. I've been doing that now for about 2 years. The test prep stuff I've been doing again for 2 decades. That's kind of crazy to say. Oops, I'm clicking on stuff and getting people in. Let me get back to that slide. Forgive me for that. So again, this is what the Stevenson School also recommends, and we share what we tell students about this test optional, and I'll get into that. That follow-up question, then you will answer this tonight. Do you have to take the SAT or ACT? And I think if you've seen any of my marketing about this course, you'll see that the answer is really no. But if you don't take it, you might close some doors, right? You might not have as many options. And so I'll talk about what that means. We'll get into how the SAT and the ACT drive admissions decisions and scholarships. And you'll see when we get to that slide, it's actually pretty blank because there's no one policy. Like there's literally 4,000 or so colleges, not even counting for-profit, not counting community colleges, and it's hard to say what the overarching policy is. But we'll try and simplify that and get into what that means. If you're hanging long enough for the last 2 questions, we get really into what the test is and how to prepare for that test. And I'll get into some quick differences between the SAT and the ACT. The quick answer is that you could take either, but we'll get into what those sound like so that you're prepared and you know where you should focus your efforts, assuming you need to focus your efforts on there. And then I'll wrap up, with the best way to prepare for the SAT or ACT. And I'll talk about some of the things that we do at CROSSWALK, but then I'll talk about things that absolutely you can do on your own. This is nothing that you have to hire someone to do. You can do all of these things on your own, and we'll get into that, right? So that's a little bit of how we'll wrap up. All right, first question then. What is the role of the SAT and ACT? I have to present a little historic information there, and don't worry, I won't bore you with all of the history going back to the 50s of the genesis of the SAT and the ACT. Really, where it is and where it's been is the only standardized measurement in college admissions. There are some schools, even though we are test optional, that still hold on to this measurement. I'll talk about which schools do that. And historically, the reason is because GPAs is one of the other measurements. It's not necessarily standardized. And we know that even in our own area. A GPA at 4.0, a perfect GPA at one of our, rigorous college preparatory schools, a private school, or even some of our very good public schools in this area, is hard to compare to a GPA of maybe a lesser resource school outside of the area, or even within our own areas, as I think about that. So if a college admissions counselor says, hey, here's a student with a 4.0 from this school, here's a student with a 4.0 from this school, it's not exactly an apples to apples comparison. There are plenty of other measurements that go into the college admissions packet, if you will, what you're submitting to schools. That can include number of APs you're taking, number of honors classes you're taking, school ranking. There's these measurements of rigor. So there's other measurements that go in there. But the only measurement that is actually the same thing that every students have to do is a standardized test, the SAT or the ACT. And the way it was designed is, and there's a couple things that we can no longer say. Initially, it was designed to be essentially a measure of college readiness, and this is the stuff that's gone away, a test that you can't really study for. That's the way it was designed. It was designed to be something that more of an aptitude, more of an IQ test, if you will, that when you're comparing students and you don't have standardized comparisons, we can say, all right, this is one test that everyone takes, that you don't prepare for, so that we can actually say, can you do math? Can you read? Can you write? Right. And that's it. That's kind of where it started. That's where it continues to be right now. Of course, we could debate that, and there's plenty of data around that. And I can get into a little bit of that right now. I won't get into too much detail. But what the data is showing today, and one of the reasons why the test is not as important for colleges as it used to be, is that the data is showing that the test doesn't necessarily predict college readiness. It can in some situations, but really what it predicts, or what it correlates to, maybe predict is the wrong word, it correlates to more things like income level of a family, education attainment of parents. It can correlate to um, language. If you are an English language learner, it's much harder for you. And those become things that colleges have been accused of using to discriminate in their college admissions. And we won't get into this today, but if you want to look it up, you could look up why UCs and CSUs are no longer requiring the test. In fact, we'll talk about this. They are test blind or test free. Same words. We'll talk about what those words mean in a moment. But really, that came about because of a lawsuit that was delivered to the UC saying this test is biased in its measurements, and it's used to discriminate. And that's why the UCs, and it, for some other reasons as well, went away with that test. And we'll get into that. So really, where are we now? The importance of the test is still there. I'll talk about which schools are still using it. And many schools, even if they say they're test optional, are using it sometimes. We'll get into that. And again, with 4,000 schools, it's hard to say what each school does. But the real story is the importance has waned. It's not as important. It is one of many inputs to your college admissions process, but it's not as important as maybe it used to be. Back in the day, I think about my experience, and probably many of you on this call, going through this process and for me, it was the early 90s. It was GPA and test score, and that was it, right? GPA, test score, and your essay, and that was kind of it. Nowadays, there's a lot more to it, and we can get into what those factors are. However, I go back to the very beginning. It is still the only standardized measurement. There is no other standardized measurement that the schools can use where every student takes the same thing, right? And by standardized, I'm saying it's the same questions, it's the same number of questions, it's the same sections, it's the same timing. All of those things make it standardized. You have to show up at the same time. It's given only certain times of the year. So really, this is where some colleges will still say that we want to use it because there's no other way to do an apples to apple comparison. So what is the role of the SAT and the ACT? It's actually a really hard question to answer because it depends. It depends. And as we get into this, we can kind of say like, okay, if it depends, then what does this whole test optional thing really mean? And I'll give you a little backstory on this, not that, again, you need to go into too much of the history. But if we start with this, the role of the SAT and ACT was to predict college readiness. Where it has landed now is a place where, again, some schools like it, some schools think it's important, and some schools think it's not that important. And over the years, as I've been doing this now for 20 years, it was probably about 10 years ago, I heard about this organization that you see down here called the National Center for Fair and Open Testing, otherwise fairtest.org. And when I first heard about them, they were promoting that these tests are biased. They were promoting that these tests aren't fair, and they were citing some of the data I was talking about. And they started gathering schools that says we don't want to use the test as much. And so they were pushing for a test optional or a test free. And that group of schools started with a couple hundred. And then through my career with this, and this is all pre-COVID, by the way, that grew to about 400, and then it was 500, and then it was 800, and then COVID hit. And then it went from about 800 to about 1,800 very quickly. If you go onto this website, fairtest.org, it's a full database of schools that are either test optional or test free. And I'm jumping ahead of myself. Let me go back to the first bullet point. Really, what test optional means. Let's make sure this is very clear. And if there's perhaps one thing you learned tonight, it is this: that test optional doesn't necessarily mean you don't have to take the test. Test optional, by definition, is the student has the option to submit a score or not, which gets us back to kind of the general recommendation. The general recommendation then becomes a student should try and take the test. Now, if you know your student is not a test taker at all, this is going to be a miserable thing for them. And this is what I work with my students on. It's super stressful. That could be a place to say, well, we're not even going to worry about that, right? We're not even going to worry about that. But generally speaking, the recommendation is take the test, but then you can opt to submit a score or not. And I'll talk about what that looks like. But what we have here, and then I have my IMO. In my opinion, this has been awesome. This has been really great. We go from a space when I started doing test prep to like students were super stressed about this process, to now a space of like, you shouldn't have to stress about it, right? If you can go out and get your score, then go for it. If you can't get that score, then that's fine too, right? There are other metrics and there are other inputs that the colleges are looking at, that can be perhaps more important than the test score. So for me as a test prep instructor, this has really allowed me to reduce a lot of stress around it. And students that I've worked with, and they know this, that one of the first things we talk about is we have them repeat this mantra. We say, stress is the enemy of test performance. And I'll get into stories if you want. I'd be happy to tell you all kinds of stories of students who, for whatever reason, had a stressful situation, even outside of tests. They had a personal situation going on. Maybe they even walked into the testing center and just immediately, had kind of some anxiety over it. Maybe they have a history of testing anxiety, all sorts of reasons, right? All sorts of stuff going on that would impact student performances. And what we worked with my students, this is prior to this kind of major shift in test optional, was really reducing stress. And what that came down to is, first of all, understanding the test. A lot of stress comes from the unknown, not knowing what you're supposed to do and when you're supposed to do it. But really it was more about, getting comfortable with that process, understanding, okay, this is what I do here, this is what I do there, and then creating a routine, right? Through knowing things and routine and practice, we reduce the stress. Now, along comes this test optional movement, and big deep breath. Big deep breath. I get to tell students, you know what? If you don't get that score that you want, you've got other stuff going on, right? And let's not forget, there's 4,000 or more colleges and universities out there that are good fits. In fact, and I'm not here to promote this, but I've co-written a book with a college counselor based in the Morgan Hill area, and she is from Salinas. She's a Spanish speaker. We launched a Spanish book and an English book, really targeted to families that don't understand this process at all. I'm assuming most of the people on the call here are on that path already, know what it means to prepare for college and understand what colleges are out there. The books that we've written are more for those families that just don't get that at all, that don't even really know where to start. Likely first generation families. We wrote the book in Spanish, so it could be for Spanish speakers. Really students that didn't know how to do this process. And when you get into that space, you get to be able to say, you know what, this is something that is one piece of the pie, but it's not the only, right? And so students and families on here, you're doing the right work already, right? You're working towards good GPAs. You're setting up connections with teachers who will write recommendations for you. Your students are working a lot on their writing already in their classes, so they'll write good essays. Many of you I know are already talking about, what college could look like for students, where they could go. Many of you have already done some visits, right? Go out and see some schools. But one of the big messages that we come across, that we try and communicate with this book is there are good fits, plural. The book is called Good Fits. And the idea is that there's not one, like I think a lot of us are like, hey, we want the bumper sticker college, right? We want the Ivy League that goes on, that goes on the resume, because we know that like, oh, that's just going to open so many more doors. And yes, it can. That's not to say anything bad about the Ivies. Obviously, if you have an opportunity to do an Ivy League or or a similar kind of exclusive or selective school? Absolutely, right? But what we want our students to understand is there's many paths to where you want to go. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a bumper sticker college, a super brand name that everybody knows about. There's many, many, many successful people in the world that have gone to just colleges that might not roll off the tongue. And this is the fun part about my job, is when you get to work with families and you get to say, hey, are you interested in this thing, right? The study element, or this kind of program, or maybe this activity, and you're like, what did you think about this school? And they're like, I've never heard of it. And their first reaction is like, what, really, that? And then you say, go look it up, check it out. And then you start to look at it and you're like, oh wait, they actually have really good programs. That's awesome, right? That's awesome. So really, this is a long-winded way to get back to the space of basically saying the test optional movement has allowed us to reduce some stress, right? To really tell students, you know what, you're not defined by this test score. Right? You're not. And this is funny, and students that are on the call, you'll laugh at this because you've already heard the story. But I tell my students all the time, I said, when you get to college and you're meeting new people and finding out who your friends are going to be, if you meet someone and the first question, or one of the first couple questions they ask you is, what did you get on your SAT? I tell my students, walk away from that person. Chances are they just want to brag about their score, right? And they've used that score to define them. And really, and you think about this, parents on the call, have you thought about your SAT or your ACT score since you took it? And you haven't? And has anybody asked you about it? And if it did, it was meaningless, right? So again, really trying to reduce the stress for students to be able to say, hey, this is one of the measurements. It's not the only measurement. We can kind of go for it, right? We can do what we can to get there, but it doesn't necessarily define you. All right, so that's good. By definition, again, this is, in my opinion, test optional is a glorious way to reduce stress for some students. Right? I think it's a really cool thing. I'm behind the movement. I've been telling students about it for years and years and years, and I hope that you find that a little bit stress reducing too. Again, if you want to check out what these policies are like, test optional, again, the student has the option to do it. Students can choose to send the score or not, and I'll get into what that looks like, but very briefly, I'll say, if your student has a score that's within the range of admitted students for the college, then yeah, submit it. Absolutely. It's in your best interest to submit it, right? If it's not in the range, then don't, right? Again, that's test optional. Before I move on, let's make sure we understand what test blind or test free means. Both are the same thing. Test blind means they won't even look at your score. They don't even want your score. And even if you could submit it, they're not going to look at it. Right. And that's test blind or test free. Again, go to the fairtest.org website. You can see their list. They got about 1,800 plus schools now, and you'll see the whole database, and there'll be some columns, and the column will say either test optional or test free. And there may be some, asterisks with that. Maybe there's a certain GPA that they say is when it's test optional or not. That depends on the school. The other vocabulary to make sure we understand is test required. There are test required schools still, not as many, but there are schools that are test required. If the school, excuse me, if the school is test required, then you have to submit a score. There's no way around it, right? There's no way around it. Could there be a possibility of a learning difference and not be able to submit the score? Maybe, but most of the times, if you have a learning difference, again, if you have if you have a diagnosed learning difference, and those of you on the call probably know who you are, you can get extended time. Usually that's time and a half. If you have more severe learning differences, you can get double time. I'd be happy to talk to anybody about that. I do have experience working with students in both of those scenarios, but I don't think if it's a test required school, even you couldn't even get out of that, right? So here's the key, right? Here's the key: is know what the colleges require. Know what the college you're looking at requires. And I've just put a very, very brief list. Test free are UCs and CSUs. All UCs and CSUs are test free. They don't even want your score. They won't even look at it, even if you submit it. Now, there may be an opportunity to submit a score in case once you're admitted, you could then get placed in a particular class, right? If you're like, hey, I'm going to be a math major, and I'm like, oh, okay, you're now admitted. we need your SAT score to know where to place you. That is an option. That is something that could happen. But generally speaking, the UCs and the CSUs are test free. This is always fun. I like to do this, especially I've done a lot of group classes in my time, and I do some work with local high schools and local districts. And maybe I'll be in a room. A couple years ago, this was pre-COVID. I was in a room with it was about 150 kids at Alice Al High School, and I had them pull up this list, right? And in those days, the list was probably about 800 schools. And I said, if the school you're looking at is test free, get up and walk out of here. You don't need to be in this class. And I'd said that probably now for about 10 years. And only one time, one student was like, I'm out of here. The school I want to go to is test free. I'm out of here. Thank you, Mr. Higgins. I'm out. And I was like, great, good. All right. Now, most of us on here are going to be looking at schools beyond just UCs and CSUs. There's other test free schools too, right? Those aren't just the only ones, but thinking about our local area, those schools are test free, UCs and CSUs. On the other side of the spectrum, what are the schools that are test required? MIT announced probably about 6 months ago. I'd have to look at my calendar and say when it was, but they announced that they're test required. When you think about MIT, makes sense, right? Super competitive, super selective. They don't want to be looking at GPA as a means of comparing apples to apples because they can't. So they've made it test required, right? And we can get into the kind of the discrimination and the bias argument around it. There are those on the MIT side that actually say no, requiring the test allows us to differentiate students and give students that are maybe lesser advantage in their schools academically a chance to shine in a test like this. This isn't the space for that debate. I know both sides of the argument. I agree in most situations with both, which is why, again, this is kind of nuanced stuff, right? And this is why you're here. This is why you're here to kind of find out about this stuff. Georgetown continues to be test required. I wrote down Georgia and Florida schools. That's not all of them. Those are typically the public schools in Georgia and Florida. Private schools would have a different policy. But I did also add it at the academies, right? If you are thinking about an Air Force Academy or a Naval Academy, those tend to require the tests. And still, this is an interesting space too. It's also a little bit nuanced, but anyone that is looking for an athletic scholarship, they tend to still require a test score. It doesn't necessarily mean that you won't get in, especially if you're a scholarship athlete, but it gives them a data point and it gives them a way to actually just say, are you college ready? Right. And we can also debate that college readiness stuff. But test optional, test free, test blind. That's kind of where we are with that one. Hope you're following with that one. I'm not seeing any questions coming in via chat, but that's fine too. So here it is. Do you take the test? Right? You've heard me say this already. I will say that yes, you should take the test. Unfortunately, people have just seen test optional and they just kind of automatically say, oh, I don't have to take the test, right? We're in a space and time, and I won't get into my opinions of human nature, but generally speaking, we want the simple solution, right? We're not prepared for the complexities or the hard work of the complexities. So we want the quick and dirty TikTok video. Oh, that's it, right? So people see test optional as like, oh, great, the option to the test, as in I don't have to take it. So there's been some unintended consequences of that. First and foremost, what we're talking about here is families don't understand that. They don't understand that actually there are some more scholarship and admissions opportunities that are going to students taking the test. For some, not all, right? Again, 4,000 plus schools out there. Because of this test optional movement and COVID, right? The test optional movement, again, was growing pre-COVID, 2019, probably about 800 schools, and then it virtually doubled, right? I can check my numbers on this. I don't know exact numbers, but it's kind of what I've been following. And doubling that was part of that because COVID, we didn't have test centers. High schools didn't want to open up to strangers. High schools didn't want to open up in the first place. So there were fewer test options. And so, the previous admission cycles in which they didn't or they couldn't take the tests meant that there were fewer places to take the test. So colleges had to respond by saying, we're just going to be optional with this, right? And ironically, well, I shouldn't say ironically, the students that were able to take the test, and this was an interesting space to follow for the COVID times, were really the students that were more resourced, right? That could travel out of state to go take a test. That's an expensive proposition, right? I mean, if you're going to go fly to another state and stay in a hotel, like that's a lot. Like, we don't need to submit, our students to that kind of experience. Again, my opinion, forgive me for that. But really what that meant is because there were fewer places to take the test, schools had to go test optional. So now what's happening is now that students are seeing test optional, there are fewer test takers and fewer submitters, right? Because fewer people are taking the test. What's happening is the students that actually submit the scores are the ones that are liking their scores, right? In the old days, it was like you take the test and it gets submitted automatically. Now with these test optional, students are choosing to submit or not. So generally speaking, those scores look like they're going higher. Again, higher in the sense of what the school data is reporting, not higher in the sense of what the College Board or ACT Inc. is seeing, but really what the school. So if you were to chart out kind of test scores in the last couple of years at a selective school, chances are it's probably going up. And that makes sense, right? Because they're test optional. The only students submitting the scores actually make them look higher, right? And this is going to be an interesting space. And we kind of have to get into the crystal ball and say, like, okay, what's this going to look like going forward? Because if scores are incrementally getting higher, we're going to see fewer students think that they can achieve that score. So maybe fewer students are taking the test, right? And there's all sorts of noise around that in terms of what the College Board and ACT Inc. are doing, because they're losing business. These are, SAT is $1 billion business, $1 billion, half of which is from the SAT, the other half from AP and other tests that they administer. But that's, a lot of money that they're losing or trying to figure out how to strategize around that. So again, the noise is the test getting easier? I don't know. That's not an answer. It'll be interesting to follow in the next couple of years. And by that time, you guys are like, I'm out. Like, I don't have, unless you have, kiddos that are a little bit younger and thinking about this in the future. Another unintended consequence is, and this is the big one, right? And this is kind of the one that is, dare I say, most concerning. Once that school commits to going test optional, this has been a huge boon to the school. Why would you think that? Well, now that it's test optional, all of a sudden, all of the applicants that couldn't get into, or they didn't think they could get into that school because they didn't have the test score, all of a sudden say, wait a second, I don't need a test score. Now I'm going to apply to that school. So our super selective bumper sticker schools, their numbers have massively increased in terms of the applications that have come in. And why has that been a boon? Well, two big reasons, right? First reason is, well, let's make it three big reasons. First reason is they have a deeper applicant pool. Right now, they have a lot more people that they can select from, and they can pick and choose who they think are going to be the best fits for their school. Well, in increased applications, a lot more money, right? My daughter is a senior. We just dropped about $500 to apply to whatever it was. There's probably about 6 or 7 schools that she needed to apply to. Application fees are generally about 70, 80, $90 now. Every time you apply to that school, those schools are getting more income, right? It's in their best interest to attract more applicants. One is the money, right? And here's the third reason why. Is the more applications a school gets, the lower their admission rate goes. Makes sense, right? School has a fixed number of applicants. A fixed number of students they can accept, a fixed number of students they can admit. And if they can get more applications, then the percentage of admitted students goes down. And why is that a good thing for the schools? Because the admission rate drives exclusivity. The admission rate drives ranking. And if you can go from a 10% admission rate to a 5% admission rate, the math behind the US News World Report then basically pushes your ranking up higher, right? And so instead of a top 20 school, you're now a top 15. That's exclusivity. Right? So here's the cynic in me. Universities want more applications. This is why they will send postcards and marketing and social media messages and all of these things to students who might not necessarily be qualified, because they want you to apply to pay the money, and they want you to submit an application, And then those applications that maybe not even qualified for makes their admission rate go down, right? And the final unintended consequence there, that last bullet point here, and this is maybe it's a good or bad thing, I'm not so sure, but students are applying to more and more schools. And we've seen this in college applications is, it used to be maybe you're applying to 8 to 10 schools, maybe as many as 12. Now we're seeing students saying, hey, there's more test optional schools out there. So instead of 8 or 10, I'm going to apply to 15 or 20. And that's just too much, right? I think 15 and 20, and I won't get into the whole college admission side of things, or at least the college planning as it relates to your applications. We can save that for either towards the end if you have questions about it. But it's just a lot of work, in my opinion, for students, right? It's a lot of work and a lot of stress that they don't need to do. A lot of that, in my opinion, comes down to crafting a good list. And that's not our topic for tonight. But basically, that list should include some schools that are good fits, plural, that aren't maybe as selective, right? And you've probably heard terms like reach or safety or target schools or likely schools, and some different vocabulary around there. But again, one of the unintended consequences of test optional is now students apply more and more and more. So here's the nugget, right? Here's the real thing. The general advice for most students, having seen all of that, even though you understand these unintended consequences are out there, even though you understand what test optional means, here's the advice. Take the test, then opt to submit the score. I'm going to say that again to make sure that sinks in. For most students, and notice most is italicized. Are there students that shouldn't take the test? Probably. There probably are. Who is that student? That student is super, super stressed, like anxiety, like physical anxiety about taking the test. I would not recommend the test for that person. I would say, let's sit down, let's craft a list of all schools that are test optional. Don't take that test, all right? But that's probably a small percentage of the population. Most students should take the test, and then you can opt to submit the score. Right? Do you submit the score? Well, there it is on those 2 bullet points there. Submit the score if it's in the range of admitted students. Generally speaking, we want it to be about in the 50%, right? If your score is within 50% of, or if the population, I should say, scores, and that fits into kind of 50% of those admitted students, then submit the score, right? It's definitely in your best interest, because what you're giving in the school is, again, a standardized data point. You get to show, hey, this is what I accomplished, just like every other student, or in a scenario just like every other student, in a setting that every other student had to do, and this is what I can do. Right? And colleges will be like, okay, that's a good data point, right? There's other data points too, right? That's not the only one. Do not submit the score if it's outside the range. Right. And this is an anecdote that it can apply to many students, but I worked with a student last year who was thinking about Barnard. Barnard is a highly selective school connected to Columbia. Her ACT score was a little low, and she came to me and was like, should I take the test? Or should I take the test again? And I looked at the score, we looked at the score, and we said, it's kind of out of the range. So the answer at that point was like, no, probably don't submit that score. But if you want to try and get a better score, this is what it's going to look like for you. And in that situation, that student only had a couple weeks till the test, and it just was going to be too stressful for her. She didn't take the test again. She did not submit the score. Guess where that student's in school right now? Yep, Barnard. It works, right? It worked for her. Now, it's not everybody's story, but it goes back to this point of take the test for the most part, see what score you have, right? And we'll get into this too. You can actually do practice tests to see if you're in the range of the schools you're looking at. And if you are somewhat in the range, then yeah, it's in your best interest to go for it, right? And get to that place of being able to say, hey, this is what I can do in a standardized testing environment. All right, good. That gets us to basically what I've been alluding to is, what is this SAT and ACT leading to in the next admissions cycle? Simply put, 2 things. And if you care about these 2 things, then it could be in your best interest to do this, right? Assuming, and I'll go back to this, right? Some of you are going to walk away with this like, yeah, everybody should take the test. And that might be it. But not everybody has to take the test. However, if the school is test optional, should you submit a score? Yes, if you're in the range, because of these 2 reasons. It can lead to greater admissions opportunities. The data on this whole kind of test optional explosion, if you will, is still probably another couple cycles away. But the early data, even right after COVID, the schools were putting out some data saying that of the admitted students, a greater percentage submitted scores. That's not all schools. That's not all schools. You could probably come back at me and be like, wait, what about this school? They said it's the exact opposite. I'd be like, that's probably true. Again, 4,000 schools out there. There's not one simple solution. But generally speaking, if you are considering highly selective schools, and what I mean by that, highly selective schools, let's just put a number out there. Their admission rate is 10% or lower. Those are highly selective schools. There's other people that could define that differently. You know, they might say 5% and lower because there are schools out there that are like 4% admission rates now, right? That's crazy to think about. But highly selective schools, and I'll say generally speaking, if the school you are considering has an admission rate of 10% or lower, that's highly selective. And in those highly selective schools, there is a trend towards greater admission opportunities for those students that submit scores. So that's a big thing, right? Second thing with that is that second bullet point is, yes, these tests can lead to greater scholarship opportunities. And I don't have an exact number or data, like what percentage test submitters get in terms of their scholarship. But let's just put the lens on of the schools. If they're comparing two students and one has a test score, they just have more data on that student. And if they're trying to entice that student, you know, if you're a California resident and you could go to a UC and you could pay whatever it is, $27,000 a year, well, you apply to a small school on the other side of the country, they're going to try and entice you away from doing your state school, and they're going to try and entice you with money, and that's scholarship, right? That's not loans. I'm talking about straight scholarship, right? We can get in the financial aid discussion. Financial aid is somewhat scholarship, somewhat grant, somewhat loans. The scholarship stuff is stuff you don't have to pay back. So what they will do is say, hey, in order to entice that student away from their state schools, we need to throw some money their way. And if they have more data on you, they know what you did in a test, they're more likely to understand you and more likely to entice you with more money. Again, I don't have like tremendous data on this. This is all school specific, but the real message is submitting test scores, if you're in the range, right? Again, if you're in the range, submitting test scores can lead to greater admissions opportunities, can lead to greater scholarship opportunities. Before I move on, let's just make sure this is very clear. That doesn't mean that if you don't submit a test score, that you won't get admitted and you won't get scholarships. It's not true at all, right? And I hate to bring it back to my own story, but this is what we're going through. My daughter, again, is a senior. She went to some test optional schools and decided not to submit some scores. She's got some scholarship money coming her way, right? And that's not because of a test score. But again, if you think of the colleges, give them that data point. If you're in the range, give them that data point, because then you'll be more likely to be admitted and you'll be more likely to access scholarship money for that. All right, so if we've gotten to that point, then we can actually say, all right, if we're going to take the test, which one should we take? Which is a pretty common question, right? Which test should I take? Should I take the SAT or should I take the ACT? Here is a very quick differentiator between the two tests. And think about you if you're a student, or think about your student if you're a parent. What sounds better for them? First place to start is that all colleges will accept either the SAT or the ACT. Either one, doesn't matter. They want a standardized test score, you can go out and get it, right? I wasn't going to get into this, but I may as well just very briefly. Generally speaking, the SAT has more regional foothold on the West Coast and on the East Coast. Generally speaking, the ACT has a more regional foothold in the Midwest. That just is historic. That's kind of where it's come from, which is why here we are in California. We probably hear more about the SAT. The College Board has done a good job of getting into the school systems and doing PSATs so the kids are ready for the SAT. The College Board is also doing a good job getting into those same schools and offering test days for the SAT. Here in our region, the ACT is catching up with that, right? And I'm hearing some more schools in the Morgan Hill and Gilroy area where they are offering the ACT as a test day, which is kind of why we hear about it more in California. There is not, and you could probably produce an article and show me, hey, what about this? But there is not a preference for colleges in which one you submit. I've had people say, oh, Ivy Leagues favor the SAT. Well, again, that goes to the regional thing, right? The SAT did a good job of getting onto the coasts. The ACT was a good job getting in the Midwest. I don't know, right? I don't know. I haven't seen any significant evidence that tells me that colleges will favor one score over the other. It goes back to this is a standardized test. They just want to see the number, right? It could be ACT or it could be SAT. So if we understand that it doesn't matter which test you take, here's a very simple way to differentiate the two. Very briefly, the SAT is two big sections, each section broken up into two subsections. So again, the SAT has 4 sections, 2 of which are math, 2 of which are verbal. 50% of your SAT is then math. 50% of your SAT score is math. The ACT also has 4 sections. It's not broken up, it's not 2 sections broken up into 2 sections. It is a English section, it is a reading section, it is a math section, and it is a science section, 4 sections. So by definition there, math is only 1/4 of your test. It's 25% of your test. Again, SAT, 50% of your test, ACT, 1/4 of your test is math. So student or parent that knows your student, if your student is more math inclined, SAT. If your student is less math inclined, ACT. Second difference there on that table is the way that these scores are calculated. The SAT takes the sum of these 2 sections, your entire verbal section, which of the subsections is the reading and the writing and language, aka English, and the math, which is 2 subsections, which is a calculator section and a non-calculator section. Math score plus your verbal score, overall SAT score. ACT, on the other hand, is the average of the 4 sections. So your English score, your math score, your reading score, your science score, divided by 4 is your overall score. So think of that mathematically. Mathematically, if you maybe are really, really good at, let's say, English, and not so good at the other ones, because the ACT is the average, maybe your English score can, on average, raise everything up. Whereas SAT, it's only the verbal side that's going to go up. So your overall score would go up. A better way to think about this is the reverse. What if you're really, really, really bad at English? Well, if you have a really bad English score, but you have a good math score and a good reading score and a good science score, the 3 of those ACT can raise your overall composite score higher. So think about that, right? Whereas on the SAT, the English is 1 section, it's just the verbal. It might not leverage that much as well because it's the sum of the 2 scores. Right? All right, third difference on our table here, and this is a general one. It doesn't necessarily apply to all students in the sense of, actually, let me say that for the last one. Excuse me. This is for most sections. Most sections. The SAT in general for most sections has fewer questions, and it gives you more time per question. That sounds good, but hold on to that, right? Because I'm gonna look at the last one in a moment. Fewer questions, more time per question. So if you have a student that's a slower processor, a slower test taker, SAT might be better. The ACT, on the other hand, is more questions and less time per question. So if you're not a fast mover, ACT might be harder for you. However, let me jump into the last one. The last one is, generally speaking, the SAT, and let's just call it like it is, it trends a little bit harder. The questions are a little bit harder. Because you have fewer questions and more time per question, the SAT's questions are a little harder. Here it is, the content and the passages and the questions are relatively more difficult. The data point on this, some of the passages on the SAT are written at or I should say you should read them, or they're written for a 13th grade level, if you will, a freshman or a what are we saying for 9th grade in college now? It's not gender-based anymore, a fresh person in college, right? So a 13th grade, whereas the ACT is more like a 10th grade level for their content, their passages, right? So SAT trends more difficult, ACT trends less difficult, again, in general for most students. So having said that, here's what I would say. If your student, and you can answer this with me, right? I know you're not chiming in on this, but you're following along. If your student is more math inclined, likes to take their time on the test, and not afraid of hard questions, SAT. If your student is less math inclined, can work quickly, and likes kind of easier question set, ACT. Right? Again, this is the general kind of difference between the two. Each student kind of has to go through their process, and what I recommend and what most experts recommend is at some point in your journey, take both. Doesn't have to be official sittings. You don't have to register for both. And by the way, let's insert this in here right away. SAT, because of its regional foothold in California, there tend to be more sites to go out and take the SAT, particularly locally. Whereas on the ACT, because their regional kind of foothold is better in the Midwest, there aren't as many sites to take the ACT. Students that I know in the last year have had to travel to San Jose. Some students right after COVID had to travel to Stockton to find a place to do the ACT. I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's good. And that's probably why some students are like, let me do SAT. Right? Because I can go do it either at my school, because they do a school day with it, or there's just more locations and more, a little easier registration to do. But again, go through both, take an SAT, take an ACT, score it, see what you like better, see what's more comfortable for you, see if you're okay with the ACT fast pace, or see if the hardness, the difficulty of the SAT isn't as difficult, but kind of go through that process, see which one works better for you, then pick one and go for it, right? But at least take the opportunity to understand the two tests, but because schools will take either test, try both, then focus on one once you've got to a place of you like that, right? And as I'm saying this, I will know that many of you will probably lean towards SAT just because students in our local area, most schools take a sophomore year PSAT, take a junior year PSAT. The PSAT is the SAT junior. It's the same setup, just fewer questions and maybe not as difficult math content. Otherwise, the PSAT is a great proxy for the SAT. And I'll put this out there for anyone on this call. If you ever want me to do a quick score analysis of a test score that you've gotten, email it to me, right? I'll give you my email at the end. You probably have it already because you're on this call and you got this Zoom link, but go ahead, and that's free, right? And that's just something, I'll look at a score, I'll be like, this is what I think. Here's the 4 or 5 bullet points that I think that you should know based on this score, work on this, study that, maybe try ACT, whatever it is, right? And that's just a little aside that I didn't really necessarily prepare for on this one. But again, let me go back to this really point, the key point. Take both, figure out which one's better for you, then go for whatever one that is, right? All right, excellent. So I got a question that came in, and feel free to chat on these questions. If I don't get it now, if I don't get in the beginning, I'll always come back to the chat. So don't be afraid. So here's the question. If taking the SAT, do schools look at the overall score, or do they look specifically at the math versus the verbal? Great question. The quick answer for me is it depends on the school. Right? Depends on the school. The general thinking is overall, right? They're going to look at the overall score, right? Because, and dare I get cynical for a moment, let's talk about super scoring really quick, right? Super scoring, I wasn't planning to talk about this, but we may as well because this is related to that question. The idea of super scoring is that, let's say you take the test multiple times, right? Which we'll get into. You probably should. Data shows that your second time that you take an official test, your score will go up on average, right? Not every student's average, but on average, right? And we'll get into we won't get into that, but we could get into the challenges of what average means. I won't get into that, right? But on average, right? The average student, their score goes up the second time they take it. The third time they take it, the score can go up a little bit more on average. By the time you hit the fourth or fifth time, you're going to plateau. Right? And I know that there's a student on here on this call that's heard me go through this because I just did it recently with them. The idea there is that the testing window is really about 8 to 9 months for most students, right? You probably take it sometime in your junior year, maybe spring of junior year, maybe take it towards the end of junior year, and then you kind of work on the summer and you have a chance to do it in the fall, right? That's about 8 or 9 months. Test taking is a skill, just like speaking a foreign language is a skill, just like playing a musical instrument is a skill, just like playing a sport is a skill. Usually speaking, to jump up significant levels in any of those skills, you got to put in significant time. Usually 8 or 9 months is not enough time to do that. It's not enough time to really jump, which is why the data shows that after the third time you've taken the test, you're going to plateau. Even if you take it next month, right? Because there's just not enough time to get better, right? Now, again, on average, right? I've seen students that in a month, they've gone up. I had a student go up 10 points on the ACT in a month, right? That jump was so high, she got a letter that said, we're accusing you of cheating, right? That story ends well. She basically was like, no, I did this. I had to write a letter and say on her behalf, we've done these things. College, that she got into didn't care, so it's fine, right? But back to this point, right? The testing window isn't very long. So to jump up significantly is pretty hard to do, right? But if you take it a couple times, your score will go up. And with this idea of super scoring, if you super score, what it means is, let's say you take the test in March, and let's say you take it again in June, right? But in March, you do really well on the math, but your verbal's kind of okay. And in June, you do really well on the verbal, but your math maybe went down a little bit. Most schools, and this is where it's on you to look it up, do the schools super score? Most schools will say, hey, we'll take your best math score and your best verbal score and combine it, right? And again, I'll be cynical about it. It's in the best interest of the schools to do that. They want the highest scores possible, because what they get to then say is, look at our admitted students. Look how high their scores are. Those scores look high. They look more exclusive. They look more exclusive. They get more applications. They get applications. The admission rate goes down. You know the story now, right? Their ranking goes up, right? So back to this question. Generally speaking, they're going to look at the overall. All right. But if the school super scores, they can cherry pick your best math or your best verbal. Same thing for the ACT, by the way. You got 4 different scores there. They can cherry pick your best math, your best English, your best reading, and your best science over a number of tests. And that's the overall score, right? So the answer to that question is generally overall, especially with the ACT, right? Because the ACT is an overall composite score. Asterisks on that. If your student is applying to a particular program, let's say they're wanting to go to some STEM program like an MIT, that's a situation where they would really look at the math too, right? They'll look at the overall, but then they'll also say, all right, how much of this score is math-based, especially if you're applying to a STEM program. Same would go for the verbal. If you're applying for some English, some maybe journalism thing or other, they might look at it that, right? So I hope I answered that question, but generally speaking, overall is more important. But particular programs could look at math and verbal. But because they super score, you should be able to cherry pick the best scores, right? Okay, good question here. When SAT scores are sent to a school, does the school see every SAT test taken by the student? Or if the student bombs one test, can that score be hidden? Great question. When you register, basically what you would do is set up, well, once your scores are out, you then get to decide where to send the scores, right? So generally speaking, they would have access to every score you're submitting. And I get this question all the time. This is something where I probably need more data points on this, but what I have heard from a handful of college counselors is that doesn't matter. What they're going to look for is the best one, right? And if you bomb one, but then come back and rock it, that's cool. Like the colleges will be like, great, this shows a little bit of, grit and resilience of the student. Now, if you do really, really well and then bomb one and don't bring it back up, you always have an opportunity to go back to the college and be like, hey, this is what happened, right? On the application, there will be like, is there anything else you want to tell us? And that's a situation where you could say, hey, I just want you to know that one day of that one SAT, XYZ happened to me. Right. I worked with a student, this was years ago, who on the morning of the test, the morning of the SAT, she was hosting an exchange student. She picked up the exchange student from Germany, picked her up at the airport Friday. Exchange student was excited. The host student wakes up Saturday morning and is like, okay, exchange student, I'll be back in a few hours. I got to go take this SAT. Exchange student's like, I want to go with you. I'm new to this country. Would show me around. Host student's like, I just got to go take this test. I'll be right back. Exchange student's like, no, I want to come with you. Host student's like, gosh, you know what? You're just gonna be sitting in the parking lot. This is locally, right? You're just gonna be sitting in the parking lot, Seaside High, and there's not much to see. I wouldn't feel comfortable. You'd be like, just hang here and I'll be right back. Next thing you know, host student, exchange student have this blow up fight. This is like 7 a.m, right? Host student finally gets to the testing center frazzled, right? She was fried, just thinking about it. She bombed it, right? Those are opportunities where you get to say, hey, college, this is what happened. And most colleges will be like, I like that. I like that you're giving me the human side of this because I'm looking at your application, I'm seeing numbers, but now you've given me a story about you, right? You have that chance, right? So yes, they will probably see most of the scores, but you'll always have a chance to be able to say, hey, this is actually what happened, right? And again, most schools will be like, that's cool. I like that this is a little bit more context. So It depends, right? Really, the answer to that question is it depends on the school. But once you put in that school into your SAT registration, unless you pull it off, they will have access to pretty much everything. But the other thing is they want a super score, so they're just going to pull the highest ones, right? So it doesn't really matter if you bomb that one. All right, good. Hope I answered that question. Again, keep those questions coming, right? All right, here we go. We're going to kind of get towards the end here, and I know I said 6 to 7:30, but we'll probably wrap up with my content in the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, and I'll make sure that all questions are answered. But here's where I jump in with this, right? Here's where I, as a test prep tutor, jumps in and starts to say, okay, how do we actually prepare for this stuff? What is it that we want to be able to do as we get ready for the test, right? And you see that first bullet point. That first bullet point is stress is the enemy of test performance, right? Part of what we want to manage in your preparation is your level of stress. If you walk into the test stressed, just like the student I told you about, that host student, it's going to show up on the test, right? This is why I will never, and I've been doing this for 20 years, I will never sit down with you and say, oh, I can guarantee a 200-point increase on an SAT. I can guarantee a 5-point increase on the ACT. I have competitors that do that. Big businesses are doing that. Oh, by the way they do that, and they've been accused of this and found guilty of it, is they give very, very difficult diagnostic tests so that your score goes really, really down. And then you take the real test, which is easier, and the score goes up. They look good, right? And they hold on to their money because they guarantee it, right? But the reason I'm not going to ever guarantee that is because I cannot control what happens to you or your student on the morning of the test or even the night before. And what we work on with my students is actually planning out the night before to be a chill night. It is not a memorize, study, stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning like you would for like a final exam. This is not that. This is not that. Test taking, here's our second bullet point, is a skill. You kind of have to develop it over time. And as you get closer to the test, much like a marathon runner would taper, would do less and less running as they get towards that marathon. A marathon runner is not going to run a marathon the night before the marathon, right? Chill, relax, get in that space of like, okay, make sure you got your test ticket, make sure you got your ID, you got your water bottle, you got your pencils, you got your calculator, and then watch a movie with your family, all right? Or go hang out with your friends, or go get Starbucks, whatever it is for you that really relaxes you, right? Because the whole goal is to manage the stress around it, right? And again, I go back to where we started this whole thing. Because things are test optional, there should be less stress about it, right? It's just, how are you going to do this day, right? I spend a lot of time with my students having them get in that space of like, the test is, let's treat it as like a puzzle or a game, let's go for it, right? It's not a fun one, mind you, it's 3 to 4 hours of like crushing the test. But if the mindset is there, if the stress is reduced, then you can perform well, right? And I spend a lot of time with my students working on growth mindset, right? Telling yourself, I'm not a good test taker yet. And I tell my story because my story started really bad. I was not a great test taker. And it wasn't until I started teaching this and then ultimately took the GMAT to get into business school that I was like, yes, mindset is everything, right? Comfort and knowledge of the test and what's on there and how to navigate it. And these strategies, they work. They work. This is a test, despite how the original test designers created it. This is a test you can prepare for, right? This is a test that you can study for. Again, test taking is a skill, right? It's time on task. And I always sit down with students, I say, do you want to take the time to do this, right? Are you prepared to do this? One of the very common questions I get from families is, what kind of student does well on these tests, right? What kind of student does better on these tests? And I always say the number one driver of increased performance is motivation. If a student is motivated, they're willing to do the work, they're willing to kind of reset their brain on how to take tests and approach this differently. If they can learn that, their score will improve, right? Which gets me to that next bullet point of this content-based versus context-based. Content-based tests are what most students are really, really trained to do. Memorize a bunch of stuff, spit it on the test the next day, right? Memorize a bunch of formulas, use them on the test the next day. Memorize a bunch of vocab, use them on the test the next day, right? Those are content-based tests. Our educational system, for the most part, there are exceptions, of course, but for the most part, are geared towards mastery of content, because now teachers have the evidence. Oh, okay, X, Y, or Z. Great, we're moving on. right? Now I can move on. This test, however, and I say this test, meaning these tests, SAT and ACT, are not content-based tests. Is there content? Yep, there's content, right? We can get into math. Math is mostly geometry and algebra. If you don't know geometry and algebra, it's going to be hard, right? But the math content kind of tops out at trigonometry. If you've had a little bit of, if you can do SOHCAHTOA, you've gotten all the contents that's on the test. What happens is in a context-based test is we mash up the content in, let's say, a word problem, or we take a whole reading passage, and with the whole context of a reading passage, you have to pick out the one word that helps you answer the question. This is a context-based test. This is, can you look at everything in front of you and in a word problem create an equation? In a reading passage, can you answer this question, right? In an English passage, can you correct this grammar point within the context of everything else? So it's a different type of test that most students haven't done before, aren't comfortable with, aren't familiar with. And if you put time on it and you learn it, just like you learn a language, learn a sport, learn a musical instrument, you can do it, right? You can do it, right? And here's the next bullet point on there is thinking about this mindset is if you don't get the score you want, that's okay, right? That's okay, assuming the school's test optional. Do your best. If you don't get the score, then don't submit it. If you don't get the score and have another chance to do it, yeah, go ahead and work on it, right? Find out what your weaknesses are. We do a funny thing in my classes where we celebrate weakness. We say, yay, weakness. You found a weakness? Oh my gosh, you're not so good at graphing parabolas? Yay, weakness. We celebrate that. That's silly, right? Why do we celebrate the weakness? Because if that's truly a weakness, then if we have time, we work on it. If we don't have time, then those are the questions on the test that you guess and move on. And now maybe you got the right answer just by guessing, but more importantly, you now have time to go find other questions that you can do, right? Now, that assumes a lot, right? If you're going for a perfect score, then you're not skipping any, right? You're going for every single one. But most students don't need a perfect score. And so that's the navigation of saying like, hey, don't spend time on that one. That's graphing parabolas, right? That was a weakness, right? We don't have time to get ready for that. So skip the graphing, guess and move on. And let's go find an algebra one or go find something else that you're more comfortable with, right? Again, if you don't achieve the score, don't submit, assumes the scores are test optional. And again, and the whole this thing with mindset is that you're not a test score. This is just one measurement of one thing on one day. It does not define you, right? And as you get out in the real world, you will see there are many, many successful people who were great test takers, and there are probably just as many successful people who were horrible test takers. It's just a skill, right? It's just a skill. It'd be like saying the same thing of there's many successful people that are good at playing poker. Not that this is poker, right? But the idea, right? And there's many successful people that are not good at playing poker, right? It's kind of the same idea. All right, a couple more things, and then I'm going to shut up. Here's a 7-step process that you can really go through. I'll go through it pretty quickly, and then I'll wrap up with kind of some resources that I can offer you here. First step is to just make that college list, right? And it's not the list that you're going to apply to. It doesn't necessarily mean these are the schools you're going to, but start making that list of schools that you're interested in. Start that process, right? Parents, have that conversation, right? And if your student is kind of like, oh, just find the time to do that, right? And maybe I've seen some families do this, like, hey, the student doesn't want to engage at every moment, right? I pick up from school, hey, we're ready to talk about colleges, and that just stresses them out. Find a time, right? Schedule a time, but hey, every Wednesday night from 7 to 8, we're just going to sit down and have a conversation about college. Here's some schools that I know about. What do you know about? Right? That's kind of a different story for this whole thing, but start making that list, right? Now, if every school is on your list, let me go back to what I said before. If every school is on your list is test free, get out of here. You're good, right? And don't worry about it, right? If some are test optional, then we'll go to step 2, right? Then we'll kind of move on to that one, right? But if everything's test free, then don't do any of this. You don't have to, right? And if you want to intentionally look for test free schools, you could do that too, right? That's the way to do it. To do all options to kind of keep all your doors open or all your paths clear, probably throw in some test optional, maybe in some test required, right? Which gets me to step 2. On that list, start researching the scores that go there, right? For the admitted students to those schools. The best source for that is the school website, right? They will show, like, you go to the admissions tab, student profile, admitted students. You can start to find that there. If you want more aggregated data, use a college guidebook. Peterson's is kind of the old school guide, or I should say Fisk. Fisk is the old school guide. You could use that. But there's also a website and an app called Niche. You can look up stuff there. There's all sorts of aggregating. College Board has a website called Big Future. There's all sorts of places to find this data. You can just Google it, right? But then you start to put in the scores there. Right now, that score becomes your goal score. To get into the school that you like, the schools that you like, you need to achieve that goal score, right? And that goal score is huge. And I'll come back to that goal score because that drives everything about prep, right? Step 3, take a practice test, right? SAT, ACT, ideally both, right? And then you score it. I'm already to step 4. Step 4, now you look at your score. And by the way, how do you score the test? It's all on the stuff. It's all on the test. The SAT has a website of 8 full-length practice tests that you can download. You can also download the scoring guide. You can do this on your own. It's all out there. The ACT has on their website 1 test and the scoring guide. They do 1 test roughly every year, but you can also Google and find old ACT tests. It's 1 document that has the test and the scoring guide on there. SAT separate documents, ACT 1 document, same stuff, right? But score it. And now you get to go to step 4 where you say, how's my practice test score compared to the goal score? That's step 4. Then what you get into is you say, okay, is there a big gap? Is my goal score way up here and my practice score is way down here? Okay, how do I get better at that, right? Then you get to step 5 and you start to work on the skills that you need to get towards your goal score. All right, that's where I probably enter with most of my students. We go through this process too, but that's where we'll probably spend, we start with the initial stuff and then we move towards, let's work on this stuff, right? But you can do it on your own, right? I'm not here to say you have to hire a tutor. You don't. There's many things you can self-teach yourself through Khan Academy. Khan Academy has a great platform that's connected to the SAT. If you register, if you have an account with College Board and you create an account with Khan Academy, you can connect them. And what happens is then Khan Academy will look at your College Board information, whether that be an old PSAT test or any SAT test, and they'll start to populate in Khan Academy. Oh, we see that you need to work on, let's go back to our example, graphing parabolas. Here's a bunch of graphing parabolas problems. Oh, by the way, here's a video you can watch. It's really cool. It's all free. It's all free, right? If you need a tutor, go for that. There's study groups that are out there. You could create, you could work with a friend. If you have a connection with a teacher, right? Bring that teacher. Most of us teachers were like, we want to help. We want to help. So if you got like, oh, I've got 6 graphing parabola questions that I have, go grab your math teacher. Hey, teach, can you help me with this? Most of the time they'll say, yeah, right? When you get to step 6, schedule that test, right? You've gone through this process, schedule your test, and then go out and take it. And here we are at step 7. Repeat steps 5 and 6 until you achieve your goal score. And notice what I put in parentheses. I said no more than 4 times, right? Generally speaking, once you hit the 3rd time, you're going to plateau, right? Unless you have a longer, window, right? If you are a sophomore on this call, if you're a 9th grader on this call, you might have a longer window. I'd caution you about stressing too much about this because you have some time. But if you want, you can start to get into this and start looking at that process. Right? All right, how to prepare. Those are those 7 steps, right? Let me remind you, you can do this by yourself, right? But you don't have to. There's really an explosion of resources in the past 20 years. When I first started doing this stuff, it was all behind paywalls. You had to buy the College Board book. You had to buy the Kaplan book. There's tons of stuff out there that's free. There's tons of, I was going to say YouTube videos, which I have some. You can get on my website and see some of mine are mostly kind of mindset videos. I haven't yet done my strategic videos. Hopefully those will be coming. But there's books out there. There's websites. I was going to say YouTube. There's even kind of probably TikTok stuff that's out there. I haven't entered the TikTok space just yet, but maybe I need to get into that space. The classes are out there. There's online classes, there are in-person classes, private tutors. Real quick, private tutors, those generally speaking are you kind of get what you pay for. There are very affordable folks that can help for maybe 25, 40, 50 bucks an hour. I'd say most of the market nowadays is in the $80 to $120 an hour. There are some that charge as much as 150. And I just read a book about a guy in New York that charges 400 bucks an hour, right? That's out there. That's out there. But again, you don't have to do this by hiring someone. These are things you can do on your own. I got a great question that came in on the chat. Let me read it for you because it relates exactly to this. When do you recommend that students begin test prep? How intensive is it? Because most students have rigorous course loads with APs and honors and sports. And so, yes, all of that, right? Okay, here's what I generally recommend is don't worry about this until probably junior year of high school. If you can start earlier and it's not stressful, there's stuff that you can do, right? The number one thing you can do, by the way, this is what your students should be doing. And don't tell them this is for test prep, just have them do it. Read. I'm gonna let that sit out there, right? Real big pause. Read, 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 read. And I tell students, I don't care what you read. You don't have to read Shakespeare. You don't have to read books, but read, right? Reading. This whole test is a reading test. Even the math section, it has those word problems. It's a reading test. So get out there and read. Invite your students to read. Read books with them. Have conversations with them. And I will tell you, it's been a battle in my own family. I have two kids. One took to the reading and continues to read, and we talk about the reading, and it's one of those things that it's a fun thing to do. The other is like, no, I don't want to read. That's a challenge I'm working through, right? I'm trying to figure that out. So it's about finding like, hey, what interests you, right? I don't want to read. Reading is boring. But I tell students like, well, if reading is boring, that's because you haven't found anything interesting to read. So let's find what's interesting. Maybe it's a graphic novel. That's fine, right? Maybe it's an audio book. That's fine too, right? But the idea is that with the reading, you're getting exposed to the grammar, the vocabulary, the structure, the way everything is on the test, right? Why do English language learners struggle with this test? Because English is not their first language because they didn't grow up reading English, right? So this is something you can definitely do whenever, right? You could start this, not that anybody is on this call with like a fourth grader, but maybe they are. Start reading, right? Read with them, read to them, talk through it, right? Make it a thing, right? And this is what, and I've really worked with my kids on this. You have to do X, Y, and Z now. Granted, COVID blew everything up, right? Because we're all stuck in our homes on our screens. And I was like, oh, what are we going to do? But it used to be like, you have to do 30 minutes of reading a day, right? And I got to get back to that my own self. But that's something you can do whenever. You can start that whenever, right? Now, when to start test prep, most families, especially in the local area, will take a PSAT sophomore year. That's a good chance to take a pulse check. Take a look at the score. And you don't have to tell your student you're doing this. Compare that to some schools that you might think about, right? Now, keep in mind, PSAT is a little bit shorter, so the score is 40 points lower. The assumption is that as they graduate into the SAT, that they will gather those 40 points, right? So the max score of a PSAT is a 1560. Max score of an SAT is a 1600, right? But forget about that for a moment. Look at the scores of the schools that you think might be interesting to talk about and see how close you are. If that is an opportunity to say, hey, would you like to do some test prep? You could start sophomore year. I don't recommend it because that can stress people out. Generally speaking, wait until you get the data of your PSAT your junior year or your student's junior year. Now look at that score. Now you can start to do this, right? How intensive is it? Here's where I want my students to stop. If I have a student and they're going to open up their test prep stuff and they hate it, I say, stop. Don't do it. Because if you're hating it and you're forcing your student to do it, and guess what? They're stressed about it because they hate it, it's not going to be effective. That's not effective learning, right? So you have to, and this is a tough one, right? This is a little bit nuanced. You have to find that space to be able to say, hey, student, we've had that conversation about this college. This college has this score. If you really want that college, then maybe we have to talk about how to get there, right? So to start then probably somewhere junior year, right? Somewhere junior year, this is a good time to do it, right? Starting 2023, this is a good time to do it. And how intensive is it? It's as intensive as it can be productive, right? Which generally speaking, I say 2 to 3 hours max a week. And that's just a general number, right? Maybe what that looks like is you have a tutoring session and then the tutor gives you some homework for some. Or maybe that's like, hey, every Saturday, maybe an hour and a half, we're gonna try a section, right? The more the student drives this though, the more effective it's going to be. If you're the parent saying you have to do this, guess what? They're going to rebel, right? They're going to rebel. And I will tell you, this is probably the most challenging parenting situation I've ever had to deal with, is finding that space with my own student, right? Finding the space with my own child. It's hard, right? It's hard, but it takes time. It takes some conversations. It takes really saying like, what do you want to do? And there are times, parents, moms, dads out there, you got to back off. You got to walk away, right? You got to walk away because, again, let me go back to this. The test score does not define your student, right? We all want our students to go to great schools. Guess what? There's a lot of great schools out there. There's a lot of great schools beyond the bumper sticker schools. There's a lot of great experiences that students can have wherever they go. They're going to find a good place to land. The fact that you're on this call already shows me that you're supporting them. They're going to be fine. They're going to be fine. So I invite you to have that conversation and be like, hey, this is what I learned. There is a test out there. The test success is a skill thing. It doesn't define you. So if you want to get better at the skill, I'm here to help you with that. I'm here to show you a path to that, right? Maybe show them a video of mine or get a book or something like that. I mean, this is what it looks like, right? So again, let me kind of just summarize that question. Recommend test prep, probably junior year. You could start as early as sophomore year, but test the waters. Is it stressful? Don't do it. If it's not stressful, you have many students are like, I want to do this, right? And they are, right? Don't feel like you're alone if your student is really wanting to do this or really hates doing this. We're all in the same boat, right? I've seen it all, right? We're all out there and we're supporting our kids in this venture. And we want to say, hey, you want some options, go for it, right? But again, if you got sports or AP or other things and they're overscheduled and they need a moment to hang with friends or go watch a movie or go watch their show, yeah, let them, right? All right, I hope I answered that one. Another question came in. If these test taking is a learned skill, why don't schools offer the PSAT or similar practice tests under test taking conditions more often and earlier so kids can get used to these over time? Woo! How's that for a question, y'all? I don't know, right? Well, I'd go back to you on this one and be like, do we care? Do we want our students to be test takers? Is that what we want? It's a tough space to be in, y'all. It really is, right? Test taking is a learned skill. So should we be spending time on tests? Personally, I teach Spanish. Many of you know this. I teach Spanish. We're not a testing environment. In fact, we're going through a situation right now where I'm having the kids memorize verb conjugations. It's new and different. And they're like, what? We don't normally do this. I'm like, nope, we don't. But this is one content area we got to be good at. So we're going to do it, right? And I might take it to, we might have a test on this, right? But I give maybe 1 or 2 tests the whole year. That's just me. Right? That's just me because I don't want to create test takers, right? That's not my goal in my Spanish class, right? If we're going to be working on SAT or ACT prep, yeah, then we're going to work on test taking. But I'd go back to the parent that said this and be like, do you want our students to be test takers? Is that what you want your student to learn in school? Look around the world and you know this, right? You know that there are other countries in which test taking is the skill, right? Do we want that? I don't know. If I think about my own children, I say, what is it that I want them to come home from at the end of the day and tell me about? I want them to tell me about, something that they learned in the sense of working with other people or looking through a different lens or, being able to do some writing. That's a big thing, right? That's kind of part of this. So I don't know. That's a tough question, right? Do we want to carve out time in our school day to teach test prep? That's a big question. Personally speaking, I can only speak personally. I don't think I would. I don't see these tests as defining our learners and defining our students. I just tell you what the game is, right? And I know what the game is because we've been doing it. The game is these tests can help for admissions and scholarships. It's not the end all be all for every student, right? And this is why we're seeing them kind of go away for some schools. And I say kind of. Ooh, that's a heavy question. I'm not sure I answered that one. It was mostly my personal opinion, right? Mostly my personal opinion. All right, so continue with how to prepare. Let me forgive me for this, but I'm gonna do a quick sales pitch for you because you hung with me for so long. It's not salesy. The invitation is to contact me and let me know if you have any questions about SAT and ACT. But I will say this, I do have a group class on this format on Zoom. It's a 6-week class. It's starting January 30th. We do 2 hours a night for 6 weeks. Each night is a different segment of the test. We do an opening night, which is general stuff. We cover a lot of stuff we talked about here. Then we do a reading night. We do an English night. We do a math night. We do a science night. It's either ACT or we go back to some of the SAT science passages. And then we do a closing study skills, how to keep going for it, right? It's 6 weeks. It's SAT and ACT. And I kind of take the temperature of the room when people sign up. I say, are you taking SAT? Are you taking ACT? Are you taking both? And we work with you on that, right? It is online. It's Monday nights, but I do record them in case a student misses. The cost is right there. And I've been told by unbiased folks that it's a very reasonable cost. I hope it is. If it's not a reasonable cost, I do offer financial aid. The website to sign up is right there. That's kind of the big group class that I have going on. And I typically do that in the winter, and I'll also do another one in the summer. And if I do have the bandwidth, I might try another one in the spring. But a 6-week course, in that 6 week, you get the nuts and bolts, right? After the 6 weeks, I then say, you got to keep going and taking tests, right? It's not over, right? It's not over. And my students hear this all the time. They say, if you just take this course and do nothing else, you will have just taken this course, and that's it, right? You got to keep working at it, just like any skill. Right? So there's the sign up there. If you're looking for private tutors, I do in-person tutoring. I have a team of tutors. We're in the local area, the 831. We can go out maybe a little bit outside. We've done some stuff in a little bit of the 408, but mostly in the 831. If you're out of the area from there, we do online stuff, right? And it's on Zoom. Again, a team of tutors, and been doing this for 20 years. And so we feel like we know how to work with students. I don't have a prescribed program of you have to do, assuming you don't do the group class. If you want to do private tutoring, I don't say you have to sign up for 24 hours of stuff. No, we work with you. We know it takes about 6 sessions to go through the basics, and then maybe another 6 sessions of working on it, but it's up to you, right? It's totally up to you. We want to be accessible. We want to be affordable. So just let me know, right? Just hit me up on that. You can always subscribe to our mailing list on the website there. And I think I got maybe a closing slide. Yeah, that's it. That's it. Here's my contact, email, my phone, and you can find us on the socials, right? That sounds so millennial, I guess, right? Forgive me for that one. My kids would roll their eyes at that. But I do have a Facebook page. Just look up Test Prep and Tutoring. I'm pretty active on Facebook, not as active on Instagram. TikTok will come soon, maybe. But YouTube, I got a series of videos there, and I'm on LinkedIn. Just find me, right? I know you have questions. Don't be afraid. And don't think like you're putting me out. This is what I do. I've been doing it for a long time, especially the people that I know. I know many of you on this call, and I'm just, hit me up. Hit me up. Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Awesome. I'm going to do a double check on the chat to see if there's any questions I didn't hit. Yes. Awesome. Thank you all. Thank you. Yeah, I just see a lot of thank yous on the chat, so I really appreciate that. If you are just joined on the video, same stuff, right? If you're just watching the video, same stuff. Hit me up. Let me know how I can help. I'm in your backyard, y'all, especially if you're in the 831. All right. Excellent. Okay. I'm going to hang out here. If you depart, you depart. If you want to hang out and just ask questions, we'll do it. I am going to stop recording though. So if you do want to, and I'll stop my screen share. So we'll officially stop the recording. I'm going to officially say thank you if you've watched for this long.